Hello. I should start with a warning that this talk contains sexually explicit images. As Egon Schiele said, I have made drawings and watercolours of an erotic nature, but they are always works of art. Now, the YouTube guidelines make it clear that explicit content is allowed as long as it's not meant to be sexually gratifying, and gratifying is not a word I associate with Schiele's work. His raw, angular complexity, one could almost say horror of humanity. Now, in his short life, he took art in a new direction and laid the foundation for an approach to the representation of the human body that has haunted and inspired artists ever since. He was born in Tulln, Lower Austria. It's about 50 kilometres from Vienna. His father Adolf was the station master in the town, and as a child he was so fascinated by trains he would spend hours and hours drawing them, to the point where he became so obsessed his father destroyed his notebooks. He had an unloving, uncaring mother and was a shy, reserved child who did poorly at school. Now, I should say at this point he displayed incestuous tendencies towards his sister Gertrude, to the extent that on one occasion his father smashed down a locked door as Schiele and his sister were alone in the room, but it turns out they were simply developing a photographic film and had locked the door to prevent the light getting in. However, when he was 16, he took his 12-year-old sister away without permission and spent a night with her in a hotel in Trieste. This was about a year or two after his father had died from syphilis, and his maternal uncle became his ward. His uncle was overbearing, was also a railway official, and wanted Schiele to follow in his footsteps, but was distressed to find out that he had a lack of interest in academia. And his uncle despised his interest in art, but in the end he reluctantly allowed him to have an art tutor. Now, Schiele moved to Vienna in 1906 to study at the Academy of Fine Arts, and what he found was a city caught between the traditional and the modern. He was convinced of his own talent and the importance of art in society, and he looked as to a mentor, as an example, to Austria's most famous artist at this time, Gustav Klimt. He was some 28 years older than Schiele, very well known, and I'll say more about the two of them in a moment. Now, Klimt had become a well-known artist in his 20s, and that led to commissions to paint complex ceiling schemes for grand buildings on Vienna's Ringstrasse. That's the wide road, the boulevard that encircles the old city centre. Now, this drawing by Klimt was in preparation for a mural at the University of Vienna, but the final result was regarded as too sexual, too erotic, and resulted in a public scandal, and he received no more state commissions after that. But despite that, he remained the leading artist in Vienna. So, in 1907, when Schiele was 17, he sought out Klimt to become a mentor. Klimt took him on, he introduced him to patrons, models, and the work of other artists such as Vincent van Gogh and Edvard Munch. Schiele left the academy after only a year. He found the teaching too conservative, too traditional, and he formed a new art group, as it was called. It held several exhibitions. He explored new techniques, jagged contours and a more sombre palette, and he gradually moved away from Klimt's more decorative Art Nouveau style. Although he remained close, they remained close until Klimt's death in 1918. In 1910, when he was 20, that was the year that Schiele broke away and found his own unique style, which we see here on the left. In a letter from November of that year, he wrote, "I went through Klimt until March. Today I think I am entirely different. It found a new style, more angular, more sexually explicit, more unusual and unconventional poses." The other difference is Schiele's figures are closely observed from life. They're defined by these heightened outlines. Unlike Klimt, he couldn't afford professional models, and he used to draw family and friends, street children and prostitutes. And his figures always confront us. They're never shy, they're never retiring, they're always full on. Now, there is a connection with the gaunt and angular bodies of Klimt's, or some of Klimt's middle work, like the Beethoven frieze, which I'm showing part of it here. However, Schiele doesn't select types to represent universal themes as Klimt did. Schiele's drawings scrutinise the individual before him, which he isolates in a sort of void of blank paper, sometimes dramatically cropped, as here. People appear alienated from any context, and yet he strongly identifies with his sitters. It's always evident that he's scrutinising, looking closely and identifying with the sitter, whereas Klimt, the figures, the models are incidental. What he's showing is a type. We don't get the everyday with Schiele, or even the full range of human emotions. His figures never symbolise anything else as they do with Klimt. We're confronted with a sort of fierceness and a tension that's projected out at us from his emaciated bodies, or parts of bodies sometimes, that they cannot be ignored. With other artists, you can walk down a row of drawings in the gallery, nodding, stopping to examine one or two. With Schiele, I feel each one grabs you and won't let you go. We may not even like them. We can call them outrageous, but we can't ignore them. What I wanted to show you here are two later works from each artist. Klimt was a favourite choice of society women, and he completed many oil paintings in his signature square format and decorative style with golden background during his golden period, which you see here. Now, Schiele needed patrons, he needed the money. Portraiture was an obvious direction to pursue. One of his patrons advised him to take this direction. He attempted this plan, and in fact initially billed himself as the Silver Klimt. But his radical approach to the human figure didn't change at this time and was unacceptable to wealthy clients. And it was only in the last year of his life that he gained unsolicited commissions from the wealthy in society. And we see here one of those, portrait of Dr. Hugo Koller. Until then, he's focused, until the last year or two of his life, his focus remained on portraying his close circle of family, friends, and a small number of male supporters. Now, in 1911, when he was 21, he met the 17-year-old Walburga Neusiel. Commonly, her name is abbreviated to Wale Neusiel, modelled for Klimt, and may have been, probably was, his mistress. And this is perhaps her best known portrait, her lowered head, auburn hair, bright blue eyes looking directly at us. This painting, incidentally, was owned by Lee Bondi Jara, a Jewish art dealer, and she was forced to hand her gallery and its contents over to a Nazi collaborator, and she fled to London in 1939 and lived until 1969. Now, the gallery and its contents after the war was seized by US forces, handed to the Austrian government, and it ended up in the Leopold Museum in Vienna. And in 2009, a court case was brought by her heirs, and it was ruled that the ownership must be transferred to the heirs. So the Leopold Museum agreed they would pay the heirs $19 million for the painting, and had to sell one of Schiele's landscapes, which we'll see later, to pay for this painting so they could keep it in the museum. This is one of his landscapes. He began to enjoy some sort of modest success. He had his first solo exhibition in Vienna in 1911. His work was increasingly sexual, often lewd studies of young women, and he controversially used young girls as models. He lived briefly in his mother's hometown of Krummau in southern Bohemia, which we see here. This is a landscape or townscape picture of Krummau. And he used to have many young children from the town visit his studio. And this attracted the disapproval of the local townspeople. Now, Schiele and Valle, his mistress and model, were driven out of the town by the residents, who strongly disapproved of their lifestyle and didn't like his use of of their teenage daughters being used as models. And so the two of them moved to Neulengbach, 22 miles west of Vienna, looking for an inexpensive studio. But again, his studio became a gathering place for the local children. Now, a teenage runaway asked them to take her to her grandmother in Vienna, and the two of them, that is, or the three of them went, that is, Valle, Schiele and the girl. They went to Vienna, but the young girl changed her mind, and the three of them returned the next day. By then, the teenager's father had filed charges of kidnapping and statutory rape, which led the police to conduct a thorough investigation of the artist and his studio. And on looking through the studio, the police found hundreds of drawings that they regarded as pornographic, and they put him in prison. He stayed in prison for 24 days until the trial. At the trial, the kidnapping and rape charges were dropped, but he was found guilty of exhibiting erotic images in a place accessible to children. It's not clear whether he showed them to the children or if the drawings were simply present in the same room. But the judge burnt one of his drawings in court to make a point. But as he'd already spent 21 days in prison, he was sentenced to just an extra 3 days. So he spent in total 24 days in prison. This is one of the many sketches he made while he was in the prison cell. He was deeply traumatized by this event and stopped using children as models. Although his drawings of adults became more sexually explicit following his release from prison. And I should say at this point that some people reject all of Schiele's art because of what most believe to be his incestuous relationship with his sister that I've mentioned, and his drawings of naked young girls. This is a difficult area for anyone who lectures on art, as there are many artists who are misogynistic, racist, homophobic, or have engaged in other repellent behaviour. What I try to do is present the facts as best I know them to let you decide. Now, Schiele was forever exploring the human body and its many psychologically tormented moods. This is a very well-known image and a good example. Bony, angular, wild-eyed, staring, twisted. His figure seemed to express the angst of the modern world. We've seen how Klimt can be recognised by his flat, decorative spaces and his symbolism, and for a 10-year period, his gold backgrounds. And Klimt typically drew as a precursor to painting. That was the end result. But Schiele drew as an end in itself and actually sold many of his drawings as finished works. So there's another one, a self-portrait, been described as among the most significant nude artworks of the 20th century. And I'll just give you at this point a quote from Schiele. He said, "I shall go so far that people will be seized with terror at the sight of each of my works of living art." So if you get that sort of feeling, it's intended. It's interesting, though, to examine the influence of another artist on his work. This is by Oskar Kokoschka, who actually studied at the same University of Applied Arts in Vienna from 1904 to 1909, and came under the influence of the Klimt secession movement. Klimt was the president of the secession movement, and this is one of his works from that period. Even more relevant is this. It's a lithograph by Kokoschka called The Dreaming Boys, and it in turn is strongly influenced by Mycenaean works of art. The figures on this reflect those on a Mycenaean silver pouring vessel. And Schiele was clearly inspired by the same angular movements, although, as you see here, he's altered the position of the leg and the arms. It's not identical, but you see I'm not implying that any of these artists copied these ideas. I'm talking about influence and inspiration. And we see, if we look at these works, if we just take Schiele's work in isolation, the multiple influences are completely lost. And I just felt that to uncover a few of such influence adds depth to an otherwise perhaps puzzling pose. I should also say that I believe that a great artist can produce works that transcend their own time and culture. So again, I'm not saying that he was following step by step in what other artists were doing at the time. Schiele himself put it better than me. He said, "Art cannot be modern. Art is primordially eternal." Exactly. Now, in 1909, he met an art critic, the art critic Arthur Rösler, at an exhibition, and Rösler immediately recognised his talent and became his spokesperson, collector and agent. And here, Schiele has given Rösler a sort of dynamic, elegant bearing, turned his head, created a harmony of form in his, although angular, it's not as distorted. And there's another influence here. Rösler gave Schiele a Javanese shadow puppet, which he played with and created angular shadow contours on the wall, like this. The puppets may have been part of his rethinking of the representation of the human form, as this was the period, starting in 1910, when Schiele's style changed from the more decorative style of Klimt to his more angular, what we might call grotesque style. And this is possibly his best known self-portrait. He's 1912, he's 22 years old, and showing us a young man who is at the same time both self-confident and fragile. Note this is a very well constructed drawing. Every line finds its continuation or a counterpart to which it corresponds. The hair and the body are both cropped by the edges of the picture. One shoulder's pulled up with the other lowered, creating a counterforce back to the intensity of the bright red physalis fruit related to the Chinese lantern flower. This is 1912, as I said, the year he was imprisoned, remember, and deeply traumatized. But nevertheless, 1912 was an extremely productive year for him. That year, he participated in exhibitions in Budapest, Cologne, Vienna, and Munich. And at Munich, he exhibited alongside the Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider group of expressionists, which included Wassily Kandinsky and Franz Marc. And the following year, he had a solo show in Munich, and then followed by another solo exhibition in Paris. He was starting to become a well-known artist. This, incidentally, the model for this is his partner, Valle, or Wallberger, who he'd been living with at this point for 2 years. Then, in 1914, he glimpsed from his window 2 sisters, Edith and Adele Harms, who lived across the street from his studio. Now, they were the daughters of a respectable middle-class family, and Schiele decided he would marry the more socially acceptable Edith, and he thought he could continue his relationship with Valle after he was married. But as soon as he explained this situation to Valle, she immediately left him and never saw him again. He married Edith the following year, 1915. It was a year, of course, after World War I had started, and he had managed up to this point to avoid conscription, but he was finally called up and stationed in Prague. And Edith moved to Prague and stayed in a local hotel, and his commanding officer allowed them to meet occasionally. But during the war, his output was more limited. He started to concentrate on the theme of mother and child. He lacked models during the war period. He often used Edith and sometimes male models. He was still exhibiting, by the way, across Europe, and because of his weak heart and excellent handwriting, he was made a clerk and then moved as a clerk to a prisoner of war camp, where he was looking after or doing the administrative work of the prisoners. By 1917, he was back in Vienna. His output during that year was once again prolific. He was invited to the 49th Secession exhibition in Vienna in 1918 and had 50 works accepted and displayed in the main hall. Now, as I said, Schiele needed patrons, and portraiture was an obvious direction to pursue, and he attempted this plan, but the sorts of drawings that he was exhibiting were unacceptable to wealthy clients. They were worried about their wives and daughters visiting such an artist, and even worse, being portrayed in this sort of way. Now, his wife, Edith, didn't like to pose naked, and this is a portrait of her in the style that he hoped would attract patrons. And his professional success was growing, and in the last couple of years of his life, he was able to emulate Klimt, employ a large number of models. His wife was becoming increasingly reluctant to pose, She was never keen. She was putting on weight, and that itself no longer satisfied his requirement for, shall we say, lean and fragile women. However, Edith's sister, Adele, seems to have been a willing model, and it's thought that she posed for this drawing, reclining woman with green socks. You can judge for yourself. This is a drawing of Adele. And she wasn't shy about posing at all. She would later claim that her relationship with her brother-in-law had not been chaste as it should have been. This painting is based on a similar watercolour drawing of his wife Edith with the same pose, but with her genitals exposed and her top covered, called Reclining Woman Exposing Herself. Now, her sister Adele later said that Schiele changed the appearance of her face to disguise the fact it was his wife, and in this painting he's combined his wife's legs with the head of a professional model. And note the complexity of the composition. The figure's at an angle to the frame. Her left knee is nearer the edge of the cloth than her right. Her right elbow overlaps the edge of the cloth, giving breaking the symmetry of the painting to giving it a tension. I should say at this point, and remember, we're in Vienna, and another influence at the time was the work of Sigmund Freud, who had just published essays on his theory of sexuality in 1905, and these ideas were discussed and circulating around the time and were of great interest to both scientists and artists. So for both Klimt and Schiele, sexuality was a topic that was of interest, being discussed by the population of Vienna, and it connected to what they saw as universal themes of life and death. I should also mention that Schiele addressed many other subjects that were regarded as taboo themes in Vienna or in many cities. Masturbation, sexual intercourse, homosexuality. And while Klimt's nudes are often seemingly lost in a dream world of sensuous abandon, Schiele's drawings confront us through their direct gaze or provocative poses that challenge any simple voyeuristic engagement. Death and the Maiden was painted around the time, or just after the time, he'd abandoned Vale and married the more socially respectable Edith. And it could be, some speculate, this painting commemorates the end of his affair with Vale Neusiedl and conveys this their separation as the death of true love. I'm not sure about that. Alternatively, it may be his separation from his wife. The two are tragically clinging to each other in what looks like a war zone. And he and his new wife were soon to be separated by the war. So it could be, it might be neither. It could be a portrayal of the separation and death brought about by war. The figures are awkward, bony, desperately clinging to each other. The man's staring eyes are distracted. He has long, bony fingers clinging to her head. She has curiously thin, long arms, made even thinner looking by the fold of the sleeve of his coat. They're disengaging, I think, as she holds him. Although best known for his figure drawings and paintings, he was also inspired by cities and landscapes and travelled across Europe. painting landscapes, local towns and cities, and it's a significant portion of his work. This painting, again, was inspired by his mother's hometown of Krummau, where, as I told you, he lived briefly in 1911. And typically, although there are, if you look carefully, there are some figures top right in the square and bottom left, and also top left. There's a figure and a person coming out of a house below the centre of the paint. There are a few figures around, but typically his townscapes are devoid of people. I like this one. This, incidentally, is one of his most important landscapes. It's sold at Sotheby's for £25 million, which was the highest price ever paid for a Schiele painting. It was, as I said before, remember this painting? It was sold, this landscape painting was sold by the Leopold Museum to raise the $19 million they'd agreed to pay the heirs of this painting, Portrait of Valet, to allow the museum to keep the painting of Valet by selling this landscape. This is a brilliant sunset on an autumn evening. The chestnut trees are slowly losing their leaves. One has lost nearly all of its leaves. And despite the beautiful landscape and despite the fact that two of the trees are closely entwined pairs, there's a feeling of melancholy, loneliness and death pervading the empty and silent landscape. And in fact, we are now in 1917, a year away from his death. In February 1918, Klimt died from a stroke following pneumonia caused by Spanish flu. And at that point, in February, Schiele became the leading painter in Vienna, and he was now becoming successful selling his work and gaining commissions. And this is one of the last oil paintings before he died of Spanish flu. The model for the woman is not his wife Edith, even though he was expecting, or she was expecting, their first child when he painted this. He originally, in fact, painted a bouquet of flowers between the woman's legs, but at some point he overpainted them with this child wrapped in a blanket, incidentally modelled by his nephew, Tony. And this painting was exhibited at the 49th exhibition of the Vienna Secession in 1918, for which Schiele, as I said now, the leading painter in Vienna, he designed the poster for the exhibition. On the 28th of October, his wife died of Spanish flu 6 months into her pregnancy. And 3 days later, on the 31st of October, Schiele died, aged only 28. In his short life, he'd created some 300 oil paintings and several thousand works on paper. The human figure, I think, provided Schiele with his most potent subject matter for both paintings and drawings. And because he died so young, it's impossible to know how his work would have progressed, because in the last couple of years of his life, his youthful, rebellious work was starting to mature into a more rounded art. He was certainly changing and maturing, but it's difficult to know how much further he would have progressed. We shall, in fact, never know. Again, thank you for your attention. Please add any comments below, and I look forward to bringing you my next talk soon. Thank you.